It's Adam here for PC Monitors, and in this video I'm going to be taking a look at the Philips 288E2UAE or 288E2E depending on your market. As usual for a video review, what you see depends on my camera, depends on the processing done by my video editing software, depends on the processing done by YouTube, and ultimately it depends on the screen that you're actually viewing the video on, so in no way does it accurately represent what the monitor looks like firsthand. This video accompanies a written review, and there's a link to that in the description of the video, alongside information about how you can support the work that we do. In these reviews, I mainly use examples from games. I use a few examples on the desktop. Although I'm using games as an example, the kind of things I'm highlighting here with respect to areas such as colour reproduction and contrast, they apply when you're doing other tasks on the monitor as well. Could be browsing the internet, could be watching something on Netflix or YouTube, that kind of thing. So just be aware of that. I just like to use games as they give some nice, engaging visual examples. This monitor uses a 28-inch 3840 by 2160, that's 4K UHD IPS type panel from Innolux, or as they like to call it AAS, azimuthal anchoring switch, because they're a little bit awkward like that. This is accompanied by a 60Hz refresh rate and support for adaptive sync. This resolution gives you a really nice amount of desktop real estate. I'm actually using it without scaling at the moment. It did take me a little bit of time to get used to this. I was using a 27-inch 4K model not too long ago, and I managed to get used to using the resolution without any scaling at all. And I actually really quite like it like that. I'm quite used to it, but things are really small. You'll be able to see that in the video. You know, the desktop icons, they're not scaled at all. They're very small. The elements on the taskbar itself, and of course text in your applications. But it's perfectly readable, it's very crisp, and as you can see, you have a huge amount of desktop real estate at your disposal. So it's really great for multitasking. I do think most people will want to use some scaling though, and I mean, I know from communicating with them that that's really an expectation with a 4K model of this kind of size. And I find 125% scaling quite a nice compromise actually. That gives you an edge in terms of the desktop real estate over a 2560 by 1440, a WQHD model. But everyone will have their own preference. You might want to use more scaling than that. But even if you do use scaling, you have to remember that you'll still retain this clarity that you get because of the pixel density. The pixel density itself is really important. So the text here is scaled nicely. I'm just using application-specific zoom, but it's a similar effect if you use scaling in Windows or your operating system instead. But the text really just has this crisp look that you don't get from models with lower pixel density, and that's certainly retained if you zoom in. There's an article all about the 4K UHD resolution which gives more examples of different scaling settings and some more things to consider with the resolution. And that's linked in the 4K UHD section of the written review. Also in the written review there are some nice images comparing 100% scaling or no scaling to 125% scaling. Really nice visual examples of that. The resolution also works nicely for suitably high resolution image content. That would include 4K UHD movie content and also gaming at that resolution. I'm now going to talk about the external features of the monitor. So lots of matte black plastics used here. It has a smart looking home office design, quite a square look. If you look at the stand base, for example, it has a section missing from the middle, so it's kind of like a rectangular loop. The stand base material is matte black plastic, but it has a brushed effect to it for just a little bit of subtle visual interest. It just catches the light in a slightly different way to smooth matte black plastic, which is what's used on the bottom bezel there. There's also a central Philips logo. It's not shiny or anything like that. This appears to be a silver paint or a silver print, so it doesn't catch the light or anything like that. So quite a blended look overall. That's also reinforced by the fact it has a dual stage bezel design at the top and sides. That means that there is a slim panel border that's flush with the rest of the screen, and there's also a slim hard plastic outer component. So that panel border, it's as good as invisible when the screen's off as it is now, but when the screen's on, as you see elsewhere in the video, you can certainly see that panel border. And this kind of design is very common for modern monitors. The screen surface is light to very light matte anti-glare, that's how I classify it. So this means that the glare handling is good, certainly is a matte screen still, but if you're in a bright room as I am now and there's direct light hitting the screen, you can see some not exactly sharp reflections, not like you'd see on a glossy screen, but it does have a bit of a glassy quality to it in some lights. But when you've got it switched on and you've got it in more sensible lighting, you don't have direct light striking the screen ideally, that kind of thing isn't really something you're going to notice or have an issue with. And the light to very light matte quality of the screen surface has benefits to the image, which are explored elsewhere in the review. And also if you go to the side here, you can see the dual stage bezel design a bit more clearly. You'll be able to see that panel border. At the side you can see that the screen is thin at the thinnest point, but it lumps out centrally where the stand attaches. The included stand offers good ergonomic flexibility. It isn't fully adjustable, so you can't rotate it into portrait and you can't swivel it, but it does at least offer tilt adjustment and height adjustment. So you can tilt the screen backwards and forwards a little bit. And you can adjust its height. Exact measurements for these adjustments are given in the written review, and that also includes the total height of the monitor at its lowest stand height, as well as the clearance of the bottom of the monitor from the desk and that kind of thing. But you can also see here that the depth of the monitor isn't extreme, and certainly if you look at where the screen is placed relative to the back of the stand, you can actually place the screen so it's quite close to the wall. So if you don't have a massively deep desk, this might be something that you appreciate. You might have also observed when I was adjusting the height of the monitor, it isn't the smoothest height adjustment. It's kind of a bit, not exactly sticky, but it just makes a bit of a grinding noise when you adjust it. So it isn't as smooth as it could be, but it still works, and I wasn't fearing that I was going to break the monitor or anything like that. And actually, just in general, although it's quite a slim looking design overall, I found the overall build to be solid enough really. At the rear, largely matte black plastic, the stand attaches centrally with a quick release mechanism. So you can see the switch there beneath the stand attachment point. If you push that up, you can quickly release the screen from the stand, and that reveals 100 by 100mm VESA holes for alternative mounting. You also see the joystick to control the OSD on the left side there, with a K slot beneath it. The OSD system is explored in the separate OSD video that accompanies this one. There's a little cable tidy clip as well, just there at the back of the stand. The ports of the monitor are found to the right of the stand attachment point in a little recessed area, as you can see there, and they face backwards. The ports are different on the 288E2E and the 288E2UAE, so it's the UAE model that I'm showing you at the moment. And the differences are that the E2E has 2 HDMI ports and it doesn't have these USB ports. It also lacks integrated speakers, so this model here has integrated speakers. That's one of the speaker grills there. There's one on the other side as well, so they're stereo speakers, 2 3-watt speakers. You're not really missing out much with the E2E model by not having those speakers because they're really very basic. They don't offer amazing sound output. They aren't the worst I've heard, but certainly aren't the best either. So there's a DC power input. The monitor has an external power brick. There's an HDMI port, or 2 HDMI ports if you've got the E2E version, and they are HDMI 2.0 ports. There's DisplayPort 1.4. And whether you're using HDMI or DisplayPort, you can run the monitor at the full 3840 by 2160 4K UHD resolution at 60 Hz. Also have support for adaptive sync, and that means you can use AMD FreeSync over HDMI or DisplayPort, and you can use NVIDIA's G-Sync compatible mode over DisplayPort only. There's a 3.5mm audio output. There's the USB upstream port, and remember these are only for the UAE version, which I'm showing you here. USB upstream, and then there are 4 USB 3.2 ports, and the yellow coloured one there supports fast charging for connected devices. I'm sitting in a nice dark room now, and I'm going to talk about contrast performance using some in-game examples on Shadow of the Tomb Raider. This monitor has an IPS type panel, so contrast isn't its main strength. This one I measured around 1000:1, a little bit above that. So it's really as expected given the specifications. Some IPS type models are a bit weaker than that, some are a bit stronger. Of course, the overriding thing to be aware of is good old IPS glow. There's a moderate amount of that here, really a rather average amount, I should say. for an IPS model of this kind of size, and you'll be able to see that quite clearly in the video. It's kind of a frosty, hazy look in the corners. You tend to see that more towards the bottom corners from a normal viewing position because you tend to have your eyes a little bit above center. But there's also something to be aware of, and that's that this can be brought out more strongly if your unit has a bit of backlight bleed or clouding, and mine does have some of that. Actually, it has a bit of a patch up in the top left there, so that's not just IPS glow, there's actually some backlight bleed there as well, but that does bring out the IPS glow more strongly. The IPS glow is also brought out more strongly if you're sitting closer to the screen and if you're using a high brightness level. But it certainly affects the atmosphere. If you're sitting in a dark room, as I am now, this is certainly something you will notice. I've brightened the room up now. It isn't a bright room, but it's just not pitch black as it was before. I'd say it's moderately bright, but really it does take the edge off that IPS glow, and the contrast in general, the perceived contrast is improved. But if you look at the very dark shades, the blacks, and compare that to the panel border, which is really sort of pure black if you like, then there is a difference, a discrepancy. Even in these moderately bright lighting conditions, the static contrast doesn't give you the same kind of inky depth that you'd get on models with much stronger contrast, some VA models, and certainly OLED and that kind of thing. But a recommendation I like to give if you generally like to sit in a dark room or generally dark room, or dimmer lighting, I would recommend having some light behind the monitor. It could be pointing at the wall behind the monitor. Some people like to use strips that stick onto the monitor and then shine at the wall behind the monitor, and you can create a kind of aura or a halo around the monitor, a halo of light, an aura of light, a bit of a glow, and that really enhances the perceived contrast if the room is otherwise dim, and it's often referred to as bias lighting, so that is certainly something I'd recommend looking into. And I'd say that not just with models with IPS type panels, it can be useful on any LCD really. Back to the gloominess now. A key advantage of IPS type models like this is their gamma consistency. So yes, there is that IPS glow, and that does eat away at detail towards the corners of the screen in particularly those bottom corners from a normal viewing position, but the detail levels are otherwise well maintained throughout the screen. With VA models you get black crush in the middle, which means that the perceived gamma is a lot higher than it should be for these very dark shades, and they become even darker, they sort of blend into a black mass. You lose out on some of the subtle detailing because of that, and actually in worst cases you can lose out on some more major details as well. And then peripherally on these VA models you'll often get extra unintended detail. Some are worse than others again in that respect, but that can give a blocky or banded appearance to some content, but that isn't always extreme. The more extreme shifts you actually see on TN models, you basically have a gradient of gamma, perceived gamma, from the top to the bottom. At the top, things are masked, the perceived gamma is far too high, things are blended together far too readily, whereas lower down you get much lower perceived gamma, and you get unintended detail, you get that banded and blocky appearance, and this can be really bad, particularly for streamed content that naturally has compression artifacts. So these little blocky elements, they're usually quite well masked, but if the perceived gamma is far too low, as it would be lower down on TN models and sometimes peripherally on VA models, then that does introduce this real blockiness. So this model, IPS type, good consistent gamma performance, good detail levels maintained throughout the screen. And I'm going to talk about those lighter shades. So I've adjusted the camera so you can see that that's a floodlight rather than just a giant ball of light. And the screen surface on this one is what I classify as light to very light matte anti-glare, so it doesn't impede the image as much as stronger matte screen surfaces. That means you don't get this sort of layered appearance, this heavy layering that some screen surfaces give you, and the light emitted from the monitor is done so in a more direct fashion, so it isn't heavily diffused or anything like that. And that better maintains your clarity and vibrancy potential as well. The screen surface texture is another thing to consider, and just because the screen surface is light or very light matte, it doesn't necessarily mean that it has a smooth finish to the screen surface. This one, it does show a bit of graininess, a bit more graininess than I'd personally like, but I'm very sensitive to this, and even then I wouldn't say the graininess on this model is extreme, and it isn't that kind of heavy or smeary graininess, which I find really nasty to look at, like someone smeared moisturiser on the screen or something like that. It doesn't have that kind of look, that kind of dirty look. But I think most people are going to be just fine with this level of graininess, or they're not necessarily going to notice it at all. I'm now on Lagom, that's lagom.nl, the website, and their tests for viewing angles. I like to start off with this because it is a good introduction to the concept of colour consistency, and that's an area where IPS type models like this are particularly strong. So the Lagom text here, it appears largely a blended grey. It has a bit of dark red striping to the text lower down the screen, but it doesn't have these sort of flashes between clear saturated oranges and reds and greens as you'd get with TN models or VA models, and they would shift if you shift your head as well. So this performance indicates a low viewing angle dependency to the gamma curve of the monitor. Looking at solid shades, this one's always a bit weird on the camera. I almost feel like I should skip over this one, but I like to be complete anyway and talk about it. And what I can see to the eye, it is sort of usually the inverse on the video, but to the eye it looks a largely pinkish purple throughout the screen, but it's actually a bit pinker towards the edges of the screen, particularly the far side edges and also towards the bottom. But this isn't an extreme shift. It's not like you'd see on TN or VA models where you have these obvious shifts between a deeper purple and a stronger pink hue, and that would follow you around very readily with even slight eye movement. Next, you've got the red block that appears a good rich red throughout the screen, quite a saturated red, and that's really very consistent overall. Again, I mean, if I'm going to nitpick, very slightly dimmer towards the edges of the screen, but that's something which I commonly observe, not specifically related to viewing angles, but a bit of a uniformity issue with models that have this dual stage bezel design, which is extremely common on modern monitors. It sort of creates a little bit of pressure, pinches in right at the end of the screen. But when I describe this, on this model it isn't extreme, it's just slightly darker than the rest of it. And again, it isn't like what you'd observe on a VA or TN model, where you would have clear shifts between a much more faded red and a deeper red, actually a very dark deep red at some points of the screen, particularly higher up on a TN model, for example. So far more consistent than that. Good saturated green chartreuse shade throughout, really very consistent. Blue block, good consistent deep royal blue throughout the screen. I'm now on Battlefield 5 and I'm going to talk about colour reproduction using some in-game examples. This monitor's colour gamut extends a bit beyond sRGB. I recorded 87% of the DCI-P3 colour space and 82% of the Adobe RGB colour space in terms of the coverage. So when you've got some coverage beyond sRGB, as you do in this case, and you're looking at most content, that includes games like this, running under SDR of course, this doesn't have HDR capabilities, this monitor. It's really designed with the sRGB colour space in mind. So you get extra vibrancy and extra saturation if the screen has a wider colour gamut than that, and you're viewing under those conditions. So this injection of extra saturation, extra vibrancy, isn't the same as a digital saturation adjustment that you might make, for example, increasing digital vibrance control in NVIDIA control panel, or increasing the saturation slider that you might have on your monitor. This one doesn't have that, but some models do, or a similar slider in the AMD graphics driver. And what that would do, that would pull shades closer to the edge of the gamut without expanding the gamut itself. So the most saturated shades remain exactly the same, and shades that are less saturated than that are really just crushed into them. So things are crushed together, you lose shade variety, things look quite cartoonish. With it being achieved with a large gamut, as it is now, you maintain that good spacing on the gamut, so you get that shade variety maintained. An extension beyond sRGB, as I mentioned, it's not extreme. You can see exactly what the gamut looks like in the written review at the start of the colour reproduction section, and you'll see that it does extend quite a bit beyond it for some shades, but less so for others. Some red shades and some green shades, but other green shades, other red shades, not so much extension. And for intermediate shades like oranges and yellows, it sticks quite close to sRGB. The end result of all of this is that the games do look a bit more vivid, and there is a bit of extra saturation beyond the developer's original intentions, but again, it's not extreme. This scene actually shows off the quite powerful reds that this monitor can produce. So because of the gamut and the way it's skewed towards those pure reds, and there's extension beyond sRGB there, the reddish browns tend to have a stronger red hue than they should have, and that can make these autumnal reds appear particularly eye-catching, a bit more red than they should be, but to be honest, it doesn't really look out of place in this particular scene. The markers there as well, good deep red. Deeper than intended again, but not really looking out of place. Some extension for the greens as well beyond sRGB, but the good news is that it isn't as extreme as on some wide gamut monitors. So when you look at yellowish greens like this, and the moss on the tree as well, sometimes it can appear almost otherworldly because the yellow components are brought out far too strongly. With this model, that doesn't really happen. I mean, it does happen to some degree, but it's not really a clear oversaturation of the yellow components. So I find that the greens actually look quite natural, and there's some good deep greens mixed in there as well. It actually looks quite lush. And although there aren't any fires here in this particular scene, I've certainly observed plenty of fires on this monitor. Not in real life, of course. I don't tend to burn monitors, but just in games and that kind of thing, and in movies. And I tend to find that the fires on this, they do look vibrant. The deeper oranges tend to verge a bit onto red, but it still maintains that shade variety nicely. There were some really nice deep oranges, which are certainly oranges rather than reds, and yellows, which are certainly yellows rather than oranges. So I think this works quite well as well there. It sort of gives a more vivid look to the fires without making them look a bit weird. So really this is a kind of look which I think strikes quite a nice balance for those that tend to like a bit of extra saturation, but don't like the more heavily oversaturated look that some wide gamut models would give. The strong colour consistency is at play as well. I've really covered that quite enough with Lagom, but you can notice that in the game as well, so you don't have these shifts in saturation that you'd get on VA or TN models. The saturation and the richness is maintained throughout the screen very nicely. I should also mention as well there's only slight oversaturation of these sky blues on this scene here. Sometimes the sky blues on wide gamut monitors can look quite sort of fantasy-like rather than anything you'd necessarily see in the real world. On this one, yes, there's a bit of extra saturation, but it's really more constrained than that, so it still looks quite in place. If you prefer to keep things closer to sRGB, there is a gamut clamp option and sRGB emulation setting on this monitor. You change colour to sRGB. This curtails the saturation. It's a bit of an odd one, at least it is on my unit, because the gamma is actually tracking 2.4 on average rather than 2.2, as I prefer it to track and is really the standard that most people would like to adhere to. So it isn't perfect and you can't adjust that, and actually that invites a bit of extra depth even though the overall saturation is reduced, so some shades actually appear a bit deeper than they should even though the overall saturation is reduced. A little bit of a conundrum there. And it also restricts the colour channels, so you can't adjust the colour channels. You can't adjust the brightness either. The good news with the brightness, at least, I always find it better if you can adjust brightness because this is a very individual thing. People have their own preferences, but at least with this one, it's locked at a moderate level. I recorded around, I think it was 160 candles per meter squared, maybe a bit above that, under the sRGB setting with the locked brightness. So it isn't extreme and it isn't uncomfortable or anything like that. It's actually within the sort of 100 to 200 candles per meter squared that most users would generally use their monitors at anyway. So it could be worse, but it still is a bit annoying to have that restricted in that way. Some people prefer a bit brighter, some a bit dimmer than that. So hardly an ideal sRGB emulation setting, but more usable than some. So with the native gamut being kind of in limbo, so to speak, so it doesn't reach DCI-P3, there's not really enough DCI-P3 coverage for work within that colour space, and there certainly isn't enough Adobe RGB coverage for work within that colour space. So just to remind you, that was 87% DCI-P3 and 82% Adobe RGB. So if you do colour critical work within those colour spaces, isn't ideal for that at all. And for work within the sRGB colour space, I definitely recommend profiling the monitor. I'd recommend this all the time anyway, and things can shift over time, so even if the factory calibration happens to be perfect, it's nice to be able to recalibrate using your own colorimeter or similar device. So that's something I would certainly recommend if you're interested in colour critical work on this monitor, or just more broadly, and that will allow you to make appropriate use of the gamut and make various other corrections for maximum accuracy. But just to reiterate again, I think for most people, the gamut here will offer quite a nice balance without extreme oversaturation, but just some licks of extra vibrancy in places. I'm back on Battlefield 5, or depending on how you look at things, still on Battlefield 5, and I'm going to talk about the responsiveness of the monitor. This is a 60Hz monitor, so you don't get that kind of connected feel or the low levels of perceived blur you would get from a high refresh rate, running at a suitably high frame rate, but there's still plenty you can consider, even within the confines of that 60 Hz refresh rate. Input lag, for example, was quite low on this one. I measured under 5 milliseconds, so that indicates fairly low signal delay, and this isn't going to be something which is going to bother most people at all, and most people are going to be absolutely fine with this level of input lag. I'd say that if you are so sensitive that you have an issue with the input lag of this model, then 60 Hz is probably not going to be for you anyway. Pixel responses are also important. So as I mentioned, the perceived blur is never going to be particularly low at 60 Hz anyway. That's a big limitation on the levels of perceived blur. But it's important that pixel responses aren't too bad. And in this case, they're certainly not too bad at all. I use the fast response time setting, that's optimal, and I look at that in more detail in the written review, pursuit photography, that kind of thing. And I will look at some of the other settings in a little bit, but just focusing on this optimal setting for now. This scene here is largely composed of lighter and medium shades and a few dark ones mixed in, and there aren't really any major weaknesses, any standout weaknesses. Most people would actually not really spot the kind of weaknesses I'm going to be talking about here, but I do like to cover them just to be thorough. So if you follow my channel quite closely, you might notice that I recently reviewed the Philips 279P1, and I did reinforce the fact that that was a productivity focused monitor. It's again a 60 Hz 4K model. It was 27 inches, but again it was an IPS model, quite similar to this one in some respects, but I found the pixel responses could have been better tuned. If you then compare it to one I reviewed a little while ago, and one I still recommend because it's actually very affordable and offers a solid all-round performance, the Philips 276E8 VJSB. Now that model was faster than that, and really with that comparison drawn, I found the 279P1 a bit disappointing. But I'm pleased to say that this model, the 288E2, that is closer to the 276E8 VJSB. Yes, I do love these ridiculous Philips model codes. Just imagine how many of these I have floating around in my head at the moment. So that's a good thing really, a pretty solid 60 Hz performance. You do get some powdery trailing, what I like to call powdery trailing, and this tends to be most pronounced where there are darker shades involved in the transition. So up here, for example, there's some dark shades with the medium to light sky in the background, and this produces this powdery trailing. It isn't smeary at all, and again, to draw another comparison with the Philips model, I'll just stick to Philips ones, why not? The 328E1CA, that's a VA model, that has way more pronounced weaknesses than this. That's actually a fairly well-tuned VA model as far as the 60 Hz 4K ones go, but even then, that had weaknesses which you certainly won't get on this model here. And coming back to that productivity-focused one, I even saw where there were mixtures of medium and darker shades, such as the bush here, the foliage here. That would just give this extra mask of perceived blur, and there'd be that kind of thing just more generally. On this one, you don't really get that. Yes, you do get some powdery trailing in places, as I mentioned, but it isn't a heavy enough powdery trailing to create this sort of clear mask of extra perceived blur. You also have to consider overshoot, inverse ghosting, and I'm pleased to say that this model doesn't have any problems there. There is some overshoot. You can see it, for example, with this sand in the background with the block here. It doesn't stand out. It might not even come across on the video, to be honest. It's just slightly brighter than the sand, and therefore stands out a little bit. It's a little bit of halo trailing. There's just a small amount of that elsewhere as well. It doesn't catch the eye, it's not extreme, and even if you're quite sensitive to overshoot, you should find this absolutely fine. I'm on a different scene on Battlefield 5 now. There are plenty more dark shades now, so there are transitions involving these darker shades, which will give the strongest powdery trailing, as I like to call it, on this model. There isn't anything which looks smeary, so certainly distances itself from those VA models. And again, the powdery trailing, it's not as extreme as it was on that productivity-focused model. So the weaknesses are more slight, and I think most people are probably not really going to notice them, are going to find it absolutely fine in that respect. Pretty solid 60 Hz performance. Perhaps the weakest transition, and this is one which many IPS models struggle with even, and certainly VA models. VA models will give a kind of smoke-like appearance here. This model gives what I would probably describe as heavy powdery trailing. And that's to say that the trailing extends a bit further back. It's a bit bolder than what I'd just call general powdery trailing or light powdery trailing. But I wouldn't describe this as smeary. And this is really probably the slowest transition you'll see on this monitor. So overall, pretty decent 60 Hz performance. And again, you can get a bit of that powdery trailing with the flag there as well. The makeshift roof here. Not extreme weaknesses by any stretch of the imagination. Nothing to really comment on in the way of overshoot. A little bit next to that tree there, but just a little bit of halo trailing. Doesn't really catch the eye, not extreme. So I'll take this opportunity now to explore some of the other pixel response time settings. They're called smart response on this model and on Philips monitors more generally. The faster setting may be of interest there. This ramps up the overdrive, so it actually gets rid of some of that powdery trailing, what I was describing as heavy powdery trailing, but it basically just replaces it with overshoot. And the overshoot now is quite noticeable. I'm not sure if this will come across on the video. It's quite difficult to capture this on the video sometimes, but I can see it around the tree and the flag post there quite clearly. Bright, colourful halo trailing. And I don't really find the edge this gives in terms of the overall perceived blur to be good enough to justify using with this level of overshoot. You can also see some dark shadowy overshoot around the light there. This will almost certainly come across on the video. This is easier to capture that kind of overshoot, so that's really not very attractive, and you get really just slim overall benefits, so I would certainly just stick to the fast setting instead. And given how low the overshoot is with the fast setting, there's really little reason to go for off. But the fastest setting, that might be worth showing you just for a bit of a laugh. This is one for people who have a bit of an overshoot fetish, really. You'll be able to see that in the video very clearly. Extreme overshoot. I suppose there's really nothing in the way of this powdery trailing, but that powdery trailing is really more subdued and less eye-catching than this overshoot anyway. Of course, it's very subjective like many things, but I don't think this particular setting is going to have many fans. And let's see that nice dirty trailing up there. Very strong, very inky. Before I go completely insane, I've switched back to my preferred fast setting. And I'm going to talk about adaptive sync, which this monitor supports. So the frame rate there, I should have mentioned before, I don't think I did. I've been running this game at a solid 60 frames a second, so I've been making the most out of the monitor in terms of responsiveness. But I'm just going to ramp up the graphics settings now. I've significantly increased the graphics settings. For those that are curious, I'm using an NVIDIA RTX 3090 at the moment, and I've had to increase the rendering resolution to 200%, so it's kind of like 8K in a way. And I'm now getting below 50 frames a second, between 40 and 50 frames a second. But this monitor supports adaptive sync, so I'm using NVIDIA's G-Sync compatible mode with my NVIDIA GPU at the moment. That's supported just fine. And I also tested with AMD FreeSync using an AMD GPU, and that worked absolutely fine as well. The experience is very similar in both cases. You get support for the technology between 40 and 60 frames a second. If your frame rate dips below 40 frames a second, the technology deactivates and you get tearing or stuttering depending on if you've got VSync enabled or not. So traditionally, if you don't have adaptive sync working or you don't have a variable refresh rate technology, VRR technology like that, you would get tearing if you have VSync disabled, or you'd get stuttering if you have VSync enabled and your frame rate departs from your 60 Hz refresh rate, or whatever you happen to have the refresh rate set to. With adaptive sync, you don't get those interruptions, so that's very nice. You can also see the technology working and the range in which it works on this monitor. If you go to Setup, Information, you'll see it says 3840 by 2160 at 43 Hz, so that's matching the current frame rate, 43 frames a second, and that changes in real time. As this changes, you'll see it's just shot up to 60 Hz. That's because the game is now running at 37 frames a second, and that's below the floor of operation of 40 frames a second, 40 Hz on this model with adaptive sync, so the technology is just deactivated, and I'm getting stuttering as I have VSync enabled, but adaptive sync can't do its thing. And now it's gone back to being within its VRR range. Just a few final points to mention. Yes, adaptive sync works just fine. And another nice thing is that the overshoot isn't extreme. Again, I'm using my preferred fast setting, and even where you're near the bottom of the variable refresh rate range, so I'm sort of below, let's say I'm below 44 frames a second at the moment, the overshoot is more noticeable than it was at 60 Hz, but it's not extreme, it's not particularly eye-catching. I wouldn't recommend setting the pixel overdrive to off even here, because you will get some weaknesses which I feel are more noticeable than the overshoot. But of course, sensitivity to overshoot does vary. I just think that this particular setting, it does work quite well throughout the range, so I would just stick to fast. And as usual, the technology doesn't compensate for the fact that you are having a lower frame rate, so around 40 frames a second versus 60 frames a second. Big difference there in terms of the connected feel. The level of perceived blur is also increased. It's always nice to have the high frame rate, but at least where that's not possible, adaptive sync does its thing and helps remove the tearing or stuttering you'd otherwise get from frame rate and refresh rate mismatches. To wrap up then, the smart home office design, I feel, is something which will be quite appealing to most people because it's not too fussy. It doesn't have a sort of gamery design. It doesn't have any outlandish features which can really put some people off. So Philips have played it quite safe in that respect. Quite an angular look, interesting look to the stand base, but if that really does happen to bug you, you could use VESA mounting instead. It does support that as an alternative. But the included stand, if you want to use that, and I think most people will want to use that, it at least offers some reasonable ergonomic flexibility, tilt and height adjustment. It doesn't swivel and you can't pivot it, so it's not perfect in that respect, but really height adjustment's the main thing that quite a few people will be looking for when it comes to their monitor. The resolution works nicely on a 28-inch screen size. I'm a bit strange in that I can use this without any scaling, but even if you are using scaling, there's plenty of advantage to be had from this really nice, strong pixel density. When you're looking at suitably high resolution image content, you're looking at text, it has this crispness, this clarity that you simply don't get from screens with significantly lower pixel densities. When it came to contrast performance, really largely in line with my expectation, quite standard for the panel type. Some IPS type models are a bit stronger, some a bit weaker in terms of the static contrast. The IPS glow was very much as I'd usually see, moderate amount of that. It's not really the main strength. More of the strength comes in when you think about the colour reproduction, and in that respect this model put in a good performance. Nice consistent colours from the IPS type panel. The colour gamut extended a bit beyond sRGB, but not as wide as some wide gamut models, so it only covered 87% of the DCI-P3 colour space and 82% of Adobe RGB, so in that respect it isn't a true wide gamut model, but it just injects a bit of extra vibrancy compared to sRGB. Some users will quite like that look, and I think actually even those that don't like traditional wide gamut monitors with stronger Adobe RGB or DCI-P3 coverage will find the extra saturation here more bearable, or actually will quite like it. It did offer an sRGB emulation setting if you want to clamp the gamut. That wasn't perfect though. You can't change many things. You can't change brightness, for example. You can't change the gamma setting, and that happened to be a bit imperfect on my unit. Although something I didn't really mention in the review, and I think it's worth mentioning actually a few points. One is that the factory calibration of mine using the native gamut was spot on. I didn't have to change anything, and that includes brightness. And it's actually the first time I've ever reviewed a monitor where I haven't even had to adjust the brightness. The white point was right where I wanted it. The gamma was right where I wanted it as well. You know, if you look at things from that perspective, I really can't complain. But one of the reasons that the brightness was actually spot on was because it was set to 80 by default, which is rather high. I wouldn't usually set a monitor that high, but that's because the peak luminance of this one is quite limited actually. It doesn't go particularly bright. It has a specified maximum luminance of 300 candles per meter squared, and I recorded a bit below that. I think it was 277 candles per meter squared. That'll be fine for most users. Most users will be targeting between 100 and 200 candles per meter squared anyway, so they'll be just fine with this. There'll be more than enough brightness for them. But some users prefer things to be brighter, especially if they're sitting in a brighter room, or they just prefer things to look brighter. That's certainly something to consider. At the lower end as well, it didn't go as dim as some users would like. Again, fine for most users, but if you're particularly sensitive and you tend to like having screens very dim, this one went down to 76 candles per meter squared without loss of contrast. And if you refer to the written review, the contrast and brightness section there are various other figures with different measurement conditions. So certainly check that out if you're interested in that kind of thing. When it comes to responsiveness, this monitor put in a decent 60 Hz performance, pretty low input lag, Decent pixel responses overall. The weaknesses gave a bit of powdery trailing in places, but they weren't pronounced weaknesses, and certainly nothing that you'd see compared to competing 60Hz VA models, and actually compared to some more productivity-oriented models, like the Philips 279P1 I reviewed not long ago. The pixel responses on this model, the 288, are stronger. Adaptive sync worked well on my NVIDIA and AMD GPUs, worked exactly as I'd expect, as I'd hope. Got rid of tearing and stuttering from frame rate and refresh rate mismatches, worked within the advertised range of 40 to 60 Hz. So overall, I think this is a nice 4K performer. I think it's priced well, and I think it offers a nice mixture of colour performance and responsiveness, good for a multitude of uses, including a bit of gaming, movie watching, and just general desktop use. So it's certainly a model I'd recommend strongly considering. If you want to look at something that's a bit cheaper and you're happy with a more restricted stand design and you don't mind a bit of a less generous colour gamut, fewer ports, that kind of thing, consider the Philips 276E8 VJSB as well. And that doesn't have adaptive sync, I should mention, either. So it's certainly more cut down, but it is cheaper and it really does offer a very strong price to performance ratio. And that is a model which I have recommended for a few years now, and I would continue to recommend considering. But if you like the sound of the extra features of this one, the 288E2UAE or 288E2E, depending on your region, then I don't think you'll be disappointed with this one. So that's really all there is to the Philips 288E2UAE or 288E2E. You should check out the full review on pcmonitors.info. There's a link to that in the description of the video, alongside information about how you can support the work that we do.